A Pact That Turned to Ash. Serafina Mancini had spent a decade playing the role of the perfect mafia wife. But when her husband was murdered, when the men who once bowed to him turned their knives toward her, she realized something dangerous. She was more powerful alone. The only man who saw it was Luca Vitali, her husband's closest friend, the one who had always watched her too closely. "Tell me, Bella mia," he murmured, his voice dark with amusement. "Are you looking for justice? Or are you looking for revenge?" Chapter 1. The Shadow of a Silent Night. The rain fell in sheets, blurring the ornate streetlights of Palermo into hazy, golden orbs. It mirrored the relentless drumming in Serafina Mancini's chest, a frantic rhythm that had replaced the steady, familiar beat of her life. Only hours ago, this city had been her gilded cage, a place of opulent beauty and suffocating expectations. Now it was a hunting ground. The black silk of her dress, still damp from the hasty, rain-soaked funeral, clung to her skin like a second shroud. She hadn't changed. Couldn't. The scent of lilies and damp earth still clung to it, a morbid reminder of the hastily arranged ceremony, a mockery of the respect due to a man like Antonio Mancini. A man who, until this morning, had controlled half of Sicily's underworld. A man who had been her husband. Serafina gripped the cold, wrought iron railing of the balcony overlooking the Mancini Palazzo's vast, neglected gardens. The storm had driven everyone inside, leaving her alone with the ghosts of the past 10 years, years spent meticulously playing the role of the docile, decorative wife. A role she had perfected, even as it chipped away at her soul. The wind whipped her dark hair around her face, stinging her cheeks. She hadn't wept. Not at the church, not at the graveside, not even when they lowered Antonio's heavy, mahogany casket into the rain-soaked earth. There was a strange hollowness inside her, a vast emptiness where grief should have been. Or perhaps, she thought with a chilling clarity, the grief had been used up long ago, drop by agonizing drop, over a decade of quiet compromises and unspoken resentments. A flicker of movement in the shadows below caught her eye. A figure, tall and imposing, emerged from the darkness, his face obscured by the wide brim of his fedora. Even from this distance, Serafina recognized the predatory grace of his walk, the way he moved like a panther through the storm-swept garden.
Luca Vitale.
Antonio's closest confidant, his consigliere, the man who had always watched her with an unsettling intensity. He stopped beneath her balcony, the rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead. He looked up, and even through the downpour, Serafina could feel the weight of his gaze. It wasn't pity she saw there, nor was it the veiled contempt she had grown accustomed to from the other men in Antonio's circle. It was something else, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck prickle. Recognition. Understanding. He tilted his head, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. "Serafina," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried easily on the wind. It wasn't a question, but a statement, an acknowledgement of her presence, of her solitude. She didn't reply, merely held his gaze, her own expression carefully blank. Years of practice had taught her to mask her emotions, to present a facade of serene composure, even when her insides were churning with turmoil. Luca slowly climbed the stone steps leading to the balcony, his footsteps muffled by the rain. He moved with a deliberate slowness, giving her ample time to retreat, to lock herself away in the suffocating safety of the palazzo. But she didn't move. Something held her rooted to the spot, a strange mixture of fear and anticipation. He reached the top of the steps and stood before her, close enough that she could smell the rain on his coat, the faint, lingering scent of his expensive cologne, a blend of cedarwood and something darker, more primal. He removed his fedora, revealing a face that was both strikingly handsome and undeniably dangerous. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jawline dusted with dark stubble, and eyes that were the color of deep-sea obsidian, eyes that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed defenses. "They're inside," he said, his voice a low murmur, almost a caress, plotting like vultures over a fresh kill. Serafina finally spoke, her voice surprisingly steady. And you, Luca? Are you not one of them? A flicker of something amusement, perhaps, or something darker crossed his face. I am many things, Serafina, but a vulture is not one of them. Then what are you? She pressed, her voice barely a whisper. He took a step closer, invading her personal space, forcing her to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. The rain continued to fall, plastering her dress to her body, outlining the curves she had always tried to conceal. Luca's eyes lingered on her for a moment, a slow, deliberate assessment that made her skin crawl and her heart pound even faster. I am the one who sees you, he said softly, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. The one who always has. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Serafina felt a tremor run through her, a mixture of fear and a strange, unfamiliar excitement. She had always known Luca saw more than he let on, that he had watched her with an intensity that bordered on obsession. But she had never dared to acknowledge it, to confront the unsettling undercurrent of attraction that had always simmered beneath the surface of their interactions. And what is it you see, Luca? She asked, her voice trembling slightly, betraying the carefully constructed composure she had fought so hard to maintain. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her cheek. She flinched, but didn't pull away. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, the electric tension that crackled in the air between them. I see a woman who has been living a lie, he said, his voice low and intimate. A woman who has been hiding her strength, her fire, behind a mask of obedience. He paused, his eyes searching hers. I see a woman who is finally free. The words struck her like a physical blow. Free. Was she? Or was she simply adrift, a ship without a rudder, lost in a storm of uncertainty and danger? Free to do what, Luca? She asked, her voice barely audible above the roar of the rain. His hand finally moved, his fingers lightly brushing against her cheek, sending a shiver down her spine. The touch was fleeting, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt of awareness through her entire body. To choose your own destiny, Bella Mia, he murmured, his voice dark with amusement and something else, something that made her breath catch in her throat. To decide whether you want justice or revenge. He stepped back, breaking the spell, leaving her standing alone in the rain, the weight of his words pressing down on her like the storm clouds gathering overhead. Justice? Revenge? The choice was hers, he said. But did she even know what she wanted? Did she even know who she was anymore, now that the role she had played for so long had been ripped away from her? The house was quiet now, but Serafina knew the silence was a deception, a fragile veil over the machinations and power plays already in motion. The question was no longer what they would do, but what she would do. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Palazzo. The heavy oak door to Antonio's study clicked shut behind Serafina, the sound echoing in the sudden, suffocating silence. The room smelled of old leather, cigar smoke, and the faint, lingering scent of Antonio's aftershave, a scent that used to make her stomach clench with a mixture of resentment and a strange, unwanted familiarity. Now, it just made her feel empty. The study was exactly as he had left it. The massive mahogany desk, cluttered with papers and files, dominated the room. A half-finished game of chess sat on a small table by the window, the ivory pieces gleaming in the dim light filtering through the heavy velvet curtains. A crystal decanter of amber liquid sat on a silver tray, alongside 2 glasses, one untouched, the other bearing the faint imprint of Antonio's lips. Serafina walked to the desk, her fingers tracing the worn leather surface. She had rarely been allowed in here when Antonio was alive. This was his domain, the place where he conducted his business, his affari, the world she was supposed to be shielded from. A world that had ultimately consumed him. She opened one of the drawers, riffling through the neatly organized files. Most of it was in code, a language of numbers and symbols that she didn't understand. But there were also letters, handwritten on thick, creamy paper, bearing the Mancini family crest, a snarling wolf's head, encircled by a laurel wreath. She recognized some of the names. Don Carlo Rossi, a rival family head from Naples Salvatore Greco, a notoriously ruthless capo from Catania, even a few politicians, their names carefully disguised, their loyalties bought and paid for. A chill ran down her spine. She had always known, on some level, the extent of Antonio's power, the darkness that lurked beneath the veneer of respectability. But seeing it laid out before her, in black and white, was a different matter entirely. It was a reminder of the precariousness of her own position, the danger that surrounded her. She closed the drawer, her hand trembling slightly. She needed to be careful. She needed to be smart. She needed to understand the game, if she wanted to survive. A soft knock on the door startled her. Before she could answer, the door opened and Luca stepped inside. He had changed out of his wet clothes and was now wearing a dark, impeccably tailored suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and lean physique. He looked every inch the consigliere, the powerful, dangerous man he was. He closed the door behind him, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the details. He didn't miss the open drawer, the way her hand lingered on the desk. "Finding anything interesting?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. Serafina straightened, smoothing down the front of her dress. "Just trying to understand," she said, her voice carefully neutral. He moved towards her, his footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could feel the subtle heat radiating from his body. "Understand what, Serafina?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. "The nature of your husband's business? Or the nature of your own predicament?" She met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "Both," she said. A flicker of admiration crossed his face. "You're stronger than you look," he said, his voice almost a compliment. "I've had to be," she replied, the words tinged with a bitterness she couldn't quite conceal. He nodded, acknowledging the truth in her statement. He knew, perhaps better than anyone, the sacrifices she had made, the compromises she had endured. He had seen it all, from a distance, watching her with those unsettling, all-seeing eyes. He gestured towards the decanter of amber liquid. "Care for a drink?" he asked. "It's Antonio's favorite. A single malt, aged for 25 years. Serafina hesitated. She rarely drank, especially not hard liquor. But she felt a sudden, desperate need for something to steady her nerves, to numb the fear that was starting to creep in. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." He poured 2 glasses, handing one to her. The crystal felt heavy in her hand. She took a small sip, the fiery liquid burning its way down her throat. It didn't numb the fear, but it did sharpen her senses, make her feel more alive. Luca watched her, his expression unreadable. "They're waiting for you," he said, his voice low and serious. "The family. They want to know what you plan to do." Serafina took another sip of the whiskey, feeling the warmth spread through her limbs. "And what do you think I should do, Luca?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. He leaned against the edge of the desk, his arms crossed over his chest. "I think you should do what you have always done, Serafina," he said, his voice a low, seductive murmur. "Survive." "And how do I do that?" She pressed, her eyes locked on his. He smiled, a slow, dangerous smile that made her heart skip a beat. "By using your wits," he said. "By using your strength. By using me." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Serafina felt a shiver run down her spine, a mixture of fear and a strange, unfamiliar excitement. She had always known, on some level, that Luca was offering her more than just protection. He was offering her a partnership, a chance to step out of the shadows and into the light, to claim the power that was rightfully hers. But it was a dangerous game, a game with deadly consequences. And she wasn't sure she was ready to play. Or was that a lie too? The image of her husband's lifeless eyes came unbidden, a stark reminder of the alternative. She took a deep breath, steeling her resolve. "And what do you get out of this, Luca?" she asked, her voice challenging. "Why help me?" His smile widened, revealing a flash of white teeth. "Let's just say I have my reasons," he said, his voice enigmatic. "And perhaps I've always admired a woman who knows how to fight for what she wants." He finished his drink. "They're in the dining room. Don't keep them waiting too long, Kara. It only makes them more anxious and dangerous. He left, leaving her to swirl the remaining whiskey in her glass. The whispers she was learning were only the beginning. The real game was about to start. And it all came down to one thing. What move would she make? Chapter 3. The Weight of Unseen Eyes. The dining room was a cavernous space, lit by a massive crystal chandelier that cast a glittering, almost surreal glow over the long, mahogany table. The air was thick with tension, a palpable sense of unease that hung heavier than the scent of the elaborate, untouched meal that had been laid out. Serafina paused at the doorway, taking a deep breath, steeling herself for the ordeal ahead. She could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their collective gaze pressing down on her like a physical burden. They were all there, the key members of the Mancini family, the men who had once sworn fealty to Antonio, and now they were waiting to see what she would do, how she would react. There was old Donatello, Antonio's uncle, a wizened, hawk-faced man with eyes that had seen too much and a mouth that rarely smiled. He sat at the head of the table, his gnarled hands clasped tightly in front of him, his expression grim and unyielding. Beside him sat Marco, Antonio's younger brother, a hot-headed, impulsive young man who had always resented Serafina's presence, seeing her as an outsider, a threat to his own ambitions. Across from him sat Giovanni, the family's capo regime, a ruthless, cold-blooded enforcer who had been Antonio's right-hand man in all matters violent. And then there were the others, the soldati, the foot soldiers, their faces impassive, their loyalty uncertain. They were all watching her, waiting for her to break, to crumble, to show some sign of weakness. But Serafina refused to give them the satisfaction. She had spent years perfecting the art of composure, of hiding her true emotions behind a mask of serene indifference. And she would use that skill now to navigate the treacherous waters of the family's power struggle. She walked into the room, her head held high, her steps deliberate and measured. The silence deepened as she approached the table, the only sound the soft rustle of her silk dress. She stopped at the empty chair at the foot of the table, the place that had always been hers, a symbolic position of subservience, of powerlessness. Donatello cleared his throat, the sound harsh and grating in the silence. "Serafina," he said, his voice raspy with age. "We have been waiting." She met his gaze, her own expression carefully neutral. "I apologize for the delay," she said, her voice calm and steady. "I was attending to some personal matters." Marco scoffed, his lip curling in a sneer. "Personal matters? Your husband is barely cold in his grave, and you are concerned with personal matters?" Serafina ignored him, her eyes fixed on Donatello. "I understand that you have questions," she said, "that you are concerned about the future of the family." Donatello nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Indeed," he said. "Antonio's death was unexpected. It leaves a void, a power vacuum that must be filled." "And you believe you are the one to fill it, Donatello?" Serafina asked, her voice laced with a subtle challenge. The old man's eyes flickered with anger, but he controlled himself. "I am the eldest," he said. "I have the experience, the knowledge, and the ambition," Serafina added, her voice soft but firm. Donatello's hands tightened into fists. "This is not the time for accusations, Serafina," he said, his voice dangerously low. "This is the time for unity, for strength." "And what about justice?" Serafina asked, her voice rising slightly. "What about finding out who murdered my husband?" A ripple of unease went through the room. The men shifted in their seats, their eyes darting nervously towards each other. They all knew, on some level, that Antonio's death was not a random act of violence. It was a calculated move, a power play. But no one dared to speak the truth. Giovanni, the capo regime, spoke for the first time, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "The police are investigating," he said. "We must let them do their job." Serafina laughed, a short, sharp sound that was devoid of humor. "The police?" she said. "You think the police will find the truth? You think they will bring the killers to justice?" She looked around the table, her eyes lingering on each man in turn. "You all know who did this," she said, her voice low, and intense. You all know who benefited from Antonio's death, and you are all afraid to speak up. Silence descended once more, heavier and more suffocating than before. Serafina could feel the tension in the room, the fear, the suspicion, the unspoken accusations. She took a deep breath, steeling her resolve. She knew she was walking a tightrope, that one wrong move could send her plummeting into the abyss. But she had to do something. She couldn't just sit back and let them decide her fate. "I will find out who killed my husband," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "And I will make them pay, with or without your help." She looked directly at Marco, "And that includes you, little brother." Marco started to object, color rising to his face, but Donatello cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Enough," the old man said, his voice weary. "Serafina, you are grieving. You are not thinking clearly." "I am thinking more clearly than I have in years," Serafina replied, her voice unwavering. "And I know this. I will not be a pawn in your games. I will not be silenced. I will not be discarded." She turned and walked towards the door, her back straight, her head held high. She could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their unseen judgment, their fear, their respect. As she reached the door, she paused, turning back to face them one last time. "I will be in my rooms," she said. "If any of you have anything to say to me, you know where to find me. But be warned, you won't talk me out of anything." She looked from face to face, all of them watching. "I am not the same woman I was yesterday." She opened the door and walked out, leaving them to their whispers, their plots, their silent, simmering war. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She would not go down without a fight. And that fight started now. Chapter 4. A Dance of Gilded Cages. The silence of her suite was a stark contrast to the simmering tension of the dining room. Serafina closed the heavy door behind her, leaning against it for a moment, her heart still pounding, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The vast, opulent space felt more like a prison than ever, a gilded cage designed to keep her isolated, controlled. She walked to the window, gazing out at the rain-swept city below. The lights of Palermo twinkled like fallen stars, a shimmering tapestry of beauty and danger. She had always loved this view, the way it made her feel both connected to the world and utterly alone. She had spent countless hours in these rooms, staring out at this same view, dreaming of a different life, a life where she was free to make her own choices, to be her own person. But those dreams had always seemed so distant, so unattainable. Now, with Antonio gone, the cage door was open, but she was terrified to step outside. A soft knock on the door startled her. She turned, her hand instinctively reaching for the small, silver pistol she had started carrying in the pocket of her dress, a gift from Luca, a silent acknowledgement of the danger she was in. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice sharp. "It's me," Luca's voice replied, low and reassuring. Serafina let out a sigh of relief, lowering her hand. She opened the door, finding him standing in the hallway, his expression calm and composed. "You were magnificent," he said, his eyes gleaming with admiration. "You had them all shaking in their boots." Serafina managed a weak smile. "I was terrified," she admitted. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Fear is a powerful weapon," he said. "Use it wisely." She walked back to the window, her gaze drawn back to the city lights. "I don't know what I'm doing, Luca," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm not cut out for this." He followed her, stopping a few feet away. "You are stronger than you think," he said. "You have a fire inside you, Serafina. I've seen it. Don't let them extinguish it." She turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "Why are you doing this, Luca?" she asked. "Why are you helping me?" He hesitated for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I told you," he said. "I have my reasons." "And those reasons have nothing to do with loyalty to Antonio?" she pressed. He smiled, a slow, enigmatic smile that made her heart skip a beat. "Loyalty is a complicated thing, Serafina," he said. "It can be bought, it can be broken, it can be misplaced." "And yours?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Where does your loyalty lie? He took a step closer, his eyes locking onto hers. My loyalty lies with you, he said, his voice low and intense. Always has. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Serafina felt a shiver run down her spine, a mixture of fear and a strange, unfamiliar excitement. She had always known, on some level, that Luca's feelings for her went beyond mere friendship, beyond loyalty to Antonio. But she had never dared to acknowledge it, to confront the dangerous attraction that had always simmered beneath the surface of their interactions. I don't understand, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her cheek. She flinched, but didn't pull away. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, the electric tension that crackled in the air between them. You will, he said, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. In time. He stepped back, breaking the spell, leaving her standing alone by the window, her mind racing, her heart pounding. What happens now? She asked, her voice unsteady. Now, he said, we wait. We watch. We plan. He paused. And we find out who killed your husband. And then, his eyes darkened, a flicker of something dangerous crossing his face. And then, he said, his voice cold and resolute, we make them pay. He moved towards a small table and the bottle of scotch she had brought from Antonio's study. You still have some of this left? Serafina nodded. Good. Luca poured 2 glasses and brought one over. We are going to need it. He handed it to her, and she met his eyes. To surviving, he said. To surviving, Serafina echoed, and they both drank. Outside the palazzo, the city hummed with life. Unseen eyes watched the windows, and unseen ears listened to the hushed words spoken within. The dance had begun, and Serafina, willingly or not, was now a player. Her next move was crucial. Chapter 5. Echoes of a Shattered Vow. The scent of jasmine drifted in through the open window, a sweet, cloying fragrance that usually calmed Serafina. Tonight, however, it only served to heighten her anxiety, to remind her of the garden below, the place where Antonio had proposed to her 10 years ago, a lifetime ago, in a different world. She paced the length of her bedroom, her bare feet silent on the thick Persian rug. Sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Antonio's face, not the cold, hard mask he usually presented to the world, but the vulnerable, almost boyish expression he had worn that night in the garden, when he had asked her to be his wife. A vow she had taken, a promise she had made. A promise that had been shattered, not by her, but by the brutal reality of the world they inhabited. She stopped at the antique vanity table, her gaze falling on the framed photograph that sat beside the silver-backed hairbrush. It was a picture of her and Antonio, taken on their wedding day. She was radiant, dressed in a flowing white gown, her eyes shining with a naive hope, a belief in the fairy tale she thought she was marrying into. Antonio was beside her, handsome and imposing in his tuxedo, his arm around her waist, a possessive grip that, even then, she had recognized as a sign of control, not affection. She picked up the photograph, her fingers tracing the outline of Antonio's face. She had loved him, once. Or, at least, she had convinced herself that she did. She had loved the idea of him, the security he offered, the escape from her own troubled past. But the love had faded, replaced by a quiet resentment, a suffocating sense of obligation. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. She quickly put the photograph down, her heart skipping a beat. Who is it? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. It's me, Luca's voice replied. She let out a sigh of relief, opening the door. He was standing in the hallway, dressed in dark clothes, his expression serious. What is it? She asked. Has something happened? He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. I need to show you something, he said, his voice low and urgent. He led her out of the bedroom and down the long, dimly lit corridor. The palazzo was silent, the other occupants presumably asleep, unaware of the secrets that were being whispered in the shadows. He stopped at a small, unassuming door at the end of the hallway. Serafina had never seen this door before. It was locked. Luca produced a key, unlocking the door and pushing it open. The room beyond was small and sparsely furnished. A single desk sat against one wall, a lamp casting a pool of light on its surface. There were no windows, no decorations, just bare walls and a cold, stone floor. "What is this place?" Serafina asked, her voice hushed. This was Antonio's private office, Luca said. A place where he kept things he didn't want anyone else to see. He walked to the desk, opening a drawer and pulling out a small, leather-bound book. He handed it to Serafina. "I found this hidden in a secret compartment," he said. "I think you should read it." Serafina took the book, her fingers trembling. The leather was worn and smooth, the pages yellowed with age. She opened it, her eyes scanning the handwritten entries. It was a journal, a diary of sorts, filled with Antonio's thoughts, his observations, his secrets. She began to read, her heart pounding in her chest. The entries were cryptic, often coded, but she slowly began to piece together the meaning. Antonio had been involved in something dangerous, something that went beyond the usual family business. He had been making deals with someone powerful and ruthless, someone who was now threatening to expose him. She read about betrayals, double crosses, and a growing sense of paranoia. Antonio had been afraid, terrified of the consequences of his actions. He had been planning to leave, to disappear, to take Serafina with him and start a new life. Tears welled up in Serafina's eyes. She had never known this side of Antonio, the vulnerable, frightened man who had been hiding behind a mask of power and control. She had misjudged him, she realized. She had seen him as a monster, a tyrant, but he had been human. She closed the book, her hands shaking. "He was going to leave," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "He was going to take me with him." Luca nodded, his expression somber. "He knew he was in danger," he said. "He knew his enemies were closing in." "But who?" Serafina asked, her voice desperate. "Who would want him dead?" Luca hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching hers. "There are many possibilities," he said. "Rival families, disgruntled partners, even someone within our own ranks." Serafina's blood ran cold. The thought that someone she knew, someone she trusted, could have been responsible for Antonio's death was almost unbearable. "We need to find out who did this, Luca," she said, her voice filled with a newfound determination. "We need to find out the truth." He nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "We will," he said. "Together." He reached out, his hand gently touching her arm. The contact sent a shiver down her spine, a reminder of the dangerous attraction that still simmered between them. She knew she should pull away, that she should maintain a distance, but she couldn't. She needed him, his strength, his support, his presence. "Thank you, Luca," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "For everything." He smiled, a slow, tender smile that made her heart ache. "You don't need to thank me, Serafina," he said. "I told you. I'm here for you. Always." He stepped back, breaking the spell, leaving her standing alone in the small, secret room, surrounded by the echoes of Antonio's shattered vows, his broken dreams, his secrets. The journal was heavy in her hands. The weight of the past pressed down, a stark reminder that the truth was often far more complicated and far more painful than she could have ever imagined. The echoes called to her now. What secrets did she hide? Chapter 6. The Unveiling of Hidden Truths. The following days were a blur of hushed conversations, clandestine meetings, and veiled threats. Serafina spent hours poring over Antonio's journal, trying to decipher the cryptic entries, to piece together the puzzle of his final days. Luca was her constant companion, her guide, her protector, helping her navigate the treacherous waters of the mafia underworld. He taught her the language of the streets, the unspoken codes, the subtle gestures that could mean the difference between life and death. He introduced her to informants, to contacts in the police force, to shadowy figures who operated on the fringes of the law. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to uncover the truth. Antonio had been involved in a high-stakes game, a dangerous alliance with a powerful drug cartel from South America. He had been skimming money, double-crossing his partners, playing a dangerous game that had ultimately cost him his life. But there was more. The journal hinted at a deeper betrayal, a secret that Antonio had been guarding for years, a secret that involved Serafina herself. One entry, in particular, caught her attention. It was dated a few weeks before Antonio's death. She suspects nothing. She believes the lies. But the truth will come out eventually. And when it does, it will destroy everything. Serafina's heart pounded in her chest. What truth? What lies? What did Antonio mean? She confronted Luca, demanding answers. He hesitated, his expression guarded. There are things you don't know, Serafina, he said, his voice low and serious. Things about your past, about your family, tell me, she demanded, her voice trembling. I need to know. He took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers. Your father, he said, he wasn't who you thought he was. Serafina's world tilted on its axis. Her father had died when she was a child, a victim of a tragic accident, or so she had been told. She had grown up believing he was a simple fisherman, a kind, gentle man who had loved her unconditionally. What are you saying? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Luca's expression was somber. Your father, he said, was a soldado, a member of the Rossi family, our rivals. Serafina's mind reeled. This couldn't be true. It was a lie, a cruel joke. No, she said, shaking her head. That's impossible. Luca pulled out a faded photograph from his pocket, handing it to her. It was a picture of a young man, his face strikingly familiar. He was wearing a dark suit, his hand resting on the shoulder of a man Serafina recognized as Don Carlo Rossi, the head of the rival family. This is your father, Luca said, his voice gentle. His name was Alessandro Moretti. He was a loyal soldier, a trusted confidant of Don Carlo. Serafina stared at the photograph, her eyes filled with tears. The man in the picture looked so much like her, the same dark hair, the same intense eyes, the same sadness. But how? She asked, her voice choked with emotion. How did he? He was killed, Luca said, his voice flat. By Antonio. Serafina gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The room spun around her, the walls closing in. Antonio killed my father? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Luca nodded, his expression grim. It was a long time ago, he said. Before you and Antonio were married. It was a vendetta, a matter of family honor. Serafina's mind raced, trying to make sense of the information, to reconcile the image of her father as a loving, gentle man with the reality of his life as a mafia soldier. And Antonio, the man she had married, the man she had thought she knew, had been her father's killer. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, her voice filled with anger and betrayal. Why did you keep this from me? Luca's eyes met hers, his expression filled with a mixture of regret and something else. Antonio made me swear, he said. He didn't want you to know. He said it would destroy you. And you thought it was better to let me live a lie? She cried, her voice rising. I thought it was better to protect you, he said, his voice firm. Protect me? She scoffed. From what? From the truth? From the pain, he said, his voice softening. From the consequences. Serafina turned away from him, her body shaking with sobs. She felt betrayed, by Antonio, by Luca, by everyone she had ever trusted. Her entire life had been a lie, a carefully constructed facade built on secrets and deception. Luca stepped towards her, his hand reaching out to touch her shoulder. She flinched away from him, her eyes blazing with anger. Don't touch me, she said, her voice cold and hard. Don't you ever touch me again. She turned and ran from the room, leaving Luca standing alone, the weight of her words, her pain, her betrayal, hanging heavy in the air. The truth was out, and it had, indeed, destroyed everything. Or so she thought. As she ran down the long, dimly lit hallway, one thing was certain. All her relationships were changed forever. The biggest question remained, what were they changed into? Chapter 7. Scars Beneath the Surface. The storm that had been brewing inside Serafina finally broke. She locked herself in her room, refusing to see anyone, to speak to anyone. She spent hours pacing the floor, her mind a whirlwind of anger, grief, and betrayal. She tore the photograph of her and Antonio into 1,000 pieces, scattering the fragments across the floor like confetti of a shattered dream. She cried until she had no tears left, until her eyes were swollen and red, her throat raw. She screamed until her voice was hoarse, until she was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. She hated Antonio. She hated Luca. She hated her father. She hated herself. She hated the lies, the deception, the secrets that had poisoned her life, that had turned her into a pawn in a game she hadn't even known she was playing. As the hours passed, the initial rage began to subside, replaced by a cold, hard emptiness. She felt numb, detached, as if she were watching her own life unfold from a distance, a spectator in her own tragedy. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank wall, her mind drifting. She remembered her childhood, the happy memories of her father, the stories he had told her, the love he had showered upon her. Those memories were now tainted, poisoned by the knowledge of his true identity, of his violent past. She remembered her wedding day, the vows she had taken, the promises she had made. She remembered the years of quiet desperation, of suffocating loneliness, of unspoken resentment. She remembered Luca, his constant presence, his watchful eyes, his enigmatic smile. She remembered the spark of attraction, the dangerous undercurrent of desire that had always simmered between them. She had trusted him. She had confided in him. She had needed him. And he had betrayed her. He had kept the truth from her, protecting her, he said. But all he had done was prolong her agony, delay the inevitable. She got up, walking to the window. The city lights were blurred, indistinct, a reflection of her own confused state of mind. She felt lost, adrift, without a compass, without a purpose. She didn't know what to do, where to go, who to trust. She was alone, utterly and completely alone. A soft knock on the door startled her. She didn't answer. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Serafina," Luca's voice said, low and urgent. "Please, open the door." She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him to go away, to leave her alone. But she couldn't. A part of her, a small, vulnerable part, still needed him, still craved his presence, his strength, his understanding. She slowly opened the door, her eyes meeting his. He looked tired, his face etched with concern, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and something else. Something that looked a lot like pain. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice hoarse. "I should have told you sooner." She didn't reply, her expression blank, her emotions carefully masked. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I know you're angry," he said. "You have every right to be." "Angry?" she said, her voice cold and flat. "Angry doesn't even begin to describe it." "I know," he said, his voice gentle. "But I want you to understand, I did what I thought was best." "Best for whom?" she asked, her voice laced with sarcasm. "For you? For Antonio? For the family?" "For you," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "I wanted to protect you." "From the truth?" she scoffed. "From your own guilt?" His face paled slightly, but he held her gaze. "I did what I had to do," he said. "I made a promise." "A promise to a murderer," she said, her voice filled with bitterness. "A promise to a friend," he corrected, his voice firm. "And what about your promise to me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Your promise to be honest, to be loyal?" He looked away, his jaw clenching slightly. "I broke that promise," he admitted. "And I'm sorry." Serafina turned away from him, walking back to the window. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He stepped closer, his hand hovering just inches from her shoulder. She didn't flinch this time, but she didn't welcome his touch either. "We find out who killed Antonio," he said, his voice firm. "And we make them pay." "And then?" she asked, her voice still barely audible. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching hers. And then he said, his voice dropping to a husky whisper, "We figure out what we are to each other." His words hung in the air between them. The scars, she realized, ran deeper than she knew. They were not just on her, but on him, too. And they were intertwined, a tangled web of loyalty, betrayal, and something else. Something that neither of them was ready to name. She turned to look at him, not fully understanding the emotions in her chest. The air was heavy. Chapter 8. A Pact Forged in Darkness. The days that followed were marked by a tense, uneasy truce between Serafina and Luca. They worked together, driven by a shared purpose to uncover the truth behind Antonio's murder, but the shadow of betrayal hung heavy between them, a constant reminder of the broken trust, the unspoken resentments. They spent hours in Antonio's secret office, poring over documents, interviewing informants, following leads that often led to dead ends. The investigation was slow, frustrating, and dangerous. They were navigating a treacherous world of lies, deceit, and violence, where one wrong move could have deadly consequences. Serafina discovered a strength within herself she hadn't known she possessed. She was no longer the passive, obedient wife, content to live in the shadows. She was a fighter, a survivor, determined to find justice for Antonio, for her father, for herself. She learned to read people, to detect the subtle cues, the unspoken messages, the hidden agendas. She learned to use her intelligence, her intuition, her femininity, to her advantage. She learned to play the game, to manipulate, to deceive, to survive. Luca watched her transformation with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. He had unleashed something within her, a force he wasn't sure he could control. He had created a partner, an equal, but he had also created a potential rival, a threat. The attraction between them was still there, a simmering undercurrent of desire that they both tried to ignore, to suppress. But it was impossible to deny. It was in the way they looked at each other, in the way they touched, in the way they spoke, in the way they breathed. One evening, after a particularly frustrating day of investigation, they found themselves back in Antonio's secret office. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with tension. They had hit another dead end, another lead that had evaporated into thin air. Serafina slammed her fist on the desk, her frustration boiling over. "It's no use," she said, her voice filled with despair. "We're never going to find out who did this." Luca watched her, his expression calm and composed. "We will," he said, his voice firm. "We just need to be patient." "Patient?" She scoffed. "How can I be patient when my husband's killer is still out there, walking free?" "We need to be smart," he said. "We need to be careful. We need to trust each other." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with irony. Trust. The very thing that had been broken, shattered beyond repair. Serafina looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and something else. Something that looked a lot like longing. "Can we ever trust each other again, Luca?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching hers. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we have to try." He reached out, his hand gently touching her arm. The contact sent a shiver down her spine, a reminder of the dangerous attraction that still pulsed between them. "We're in this together, Serafina," he said, his voice low and intense. "Whether we like it or not." She nodded, her eyes meeting his. She knew he was right. They were bound together, by fate, by circumstance, by something else. "We need a new plan," she said, her voice regaining some of its strength. "We need to think outside the box." "I agree," he said. "We need to go deeper. We need to find someone who knows the truth, someone who is willing to talk." "And how do we do that?" she asked. He smiled, a slow, dangerous smile that made her heart skip a beat. "We use our resources," he said. "We use our connections. We use our charm." He stepped closer, his body almost touching hers. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the electric tension that crackled in the air between them. "We make them an offer they can't refuse," he said, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. "And if they refuse?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. His eyes darkened, a flicker of something dangerous crossing his face. "Then we make them regret it," he said, his voice cold and resolute. Serafina knew what he was suggesting. They were crossing a line, stepping into a world of darkness, of violence, of no return. She hesitated for a moment, her conscience warring with her desire for justice, for revenge. But the image of Antonio's lifeless body, the memory of her father's betrayal, the knowledge of her own shattered life, pushed her over the edge. "Do it," she said, her voice firm. "Do whatever it takes." He nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "We're in this together, remember?" he said, his voice soft but firm. "Until the end." A pact was forged, a silent agreement, a dangerous alliance. They were partners, conspirators, bound together by a shared purpose, a shared darkness. They both knew that this could cost them everything. It could very well ruin them and all that they loved. But in that moment, in that darkened office, they had no other option. The city outside hummed with life. They now had to enter that life and see if they could find the truth. But would they survive it? Chapter 9. The Price of Lost Innocence. The offer Luca had alluded to involved a carefully orchestrated plan, a dangerous dance of seduction and intimidation. Their target was Don Carlo Rossi, the head of the rival family, the man who had been Antonio's sworn enemy, and, as Serafina now knew, her father's former boss. Don Carlo was a formidable opponent, a ruthless, cunning man who had ruled his family with an iron fist for decades. He was known for his cruelty, his paranoia, and his weakness for beautiful women. Luca's plan was simple, yet audacious. Serafina would use her beauty, her charm, her vulnerability, to get close to Don Carlo, to gain his trust, to extract information from him. It was a dangerous game, a high-stakes gamble that could cost her everything. Serafina hesitated. She was not a seductress, not a femme fatale. She was a widow, a grieving woman, a pawn in a game she was still trying to understand. But she also knew that she was the only one who could do this. She was the only one who had the access, the knowledge, the motivation. She looked at Luca, her eyes searching his. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "This is dangerous." He nodded, his expression serious. "It's the only way," he said. "We have no other choice." "And what if I fail?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. His eyes darkened, a flicker of something dangerous crossing his face. "You won't fail," he said, his voice firm. "I won't let you." He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. The contact sent a shiver down her spine, a reminder of the complex, unspoken emotions that flowed between them. "I'll be there," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "I'll be watching. I'll be protecting you." Serafina nodded, her eyes meeting his. She trusted him, despite everything. She had to. The plan was set in motion. Serafina, dressed in a stunning black dress that accentuated her curves, her dark hair cascading down her shoulders, her eyes smoky and alluring, attended a lavish party hosted by one of Don Carlo's associates. She played the part of the grieving widow, the vulnerable, lonely woman seeking solace, seeking connection. She caught Don Carlo's eye, her gaze lingering on him for a moment, a hint of sadness, a hint of invitation. He approached her, his eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and lust. He was an older man, his face lined with age and experience, his eyes cold and calculating. But there was also a flicker of something else, a hint of loneliness, a hint of desire. They talked, they danced, they flirted. Serafina played her part perfectly, feigning interest, feigning vulnerability, feigning attraction. She laughed at his jokes. She listened to his stories. She flattered his ego. She hated every minute of it. She felt dirty, cheap, used. But she also felt a strange sense of power, a sense of control. She was manipulating him, playing him, using him. As the evening progressed, she subtly steered the conversation towards Antonio, towards the circumstances of his death. Don Carlo was cautious, guarded, but Serafina was persistent, her questions veiled, her probe subtle. She learned that Don Carlo had indeed been involved in Antonio's death, but he was not the mastermind. He was a pawn, just like Antonio, just like her. There was someone else, someone pulling the strings, someone more powerful, more dangerous, someone closer. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The betrayal was deeper, more profound, more personal. She excused herself, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She needed to talk to Luca, to tell him what she had learned. She found him waiting for her in a secluded corner of the garden, his face hidden in the shadows. "It's not Rossi," she said, her voice breathless. "It's someone else. Someone closer." Luca's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenching. "Who?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Serafina hesitated, her hand trembling. She didn't want to say the name, didn't want to believe it. But she had to. "I think," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "it's someone in our family." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken accusations, of shattered trust, of impending doom. The price of lost innocence, Serafina realized, was far greater than she had ever imagined. It was the loss of everything she had ever believed in, everything she had ever held dear. It was the loss of herself. The gardens were quiet now, save for the crickets. But Serafina heard something different. A faint whisper of movement. It appeared that the game was escalating, and they were now being watched. Chapter 10. Between Loyalty and Betrayal. The revelation that the mastermind behind Antonio's murder was someone within their own family sent a shockwave through Serafina and Luca's already fragile alliance. Suspicion hung heavy in the air, poisoning every interaction, every conversation. Every member of the Mancini family became a potential suspect, their motives, their actions, their loyalties scrutinized under a harsh, unforgiving light. The prime suspect was Marco, Antonio's younger brother. He had always been ambitious, resentful of Antonio's power, and openly hostile towards Serafina. He had the most to gain from Antonio's death, and he had made no secret of his desire to take over the family business. But there were other possibilities. Donatello, the old patriarch, was a cunning, manipulative man who had always prioritized the family's interests above all else. He had the experience, the connections, and the ruthlessness to orchestrate such a betrayal. And then there was Giovanni, the capo regime, the enforcer, the man who had been Antonio's right-hand man in all matters violent. He was a cold-blooded killer, a man without a conscience, a man who would do anything for money, for power, for loyalty. Serafina and Luca found themselves caught in a web of intrigue, paranoia, and deception. They didn't know who to trust, who to believe. Every conversation was a minefield, every gesture a potential clue. They decided to focus their attention on Marco, gathering evidence, monitoring his movements, intercepting his communications. They discovered that he had been secretly meeting with representatives of a rival family, the Morettis from Naples, the family, Serafina realized with a sickening jolt, of her own father. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but the picture that was emerging was more disturbing, more complex than they had ever imagined. One evening, Luca came to Serafina's room, his face grim, his expression urgent. "We have a problem," he said, his voice low and serious. "Marco knows we're watching him." Serafina's heart skipped a beat. "How?" she asked, her voice trembling. "He has eyes and ears everywhere," Luca said. "He's always been paranoid, suspicious. He's been playing us, just like we've been playing him." "What do we do?" she asked, her voice filled with fear. "We confront him," Luca said, his voice firm. "We force his hand. We make him reveal the truth." It was a dangerous plan, a reckless gamble. But they had no other choice. They were running out of time, running out of options. They arranged a meeting with Marco, a private, secluded rendezvous in the old, abandoned warehouse that Antonio had used for his less legitimate business dealings. The warehouse was a cavernous, dark, and eerie space, filled with the ghosts of past deals, past betrayals, past violence. The air was thick with the scent of dust, decay, and fear. Marco arrived, accompanied by two of his soldati, their faces impassive, their hands hovering near their weapons. He was dressed in a dark suit, his expression arrogant, his eyes filled with a mixture of contempt and nervousness. Serafina and Luca stood waiting for him, their own weapons concealed, their expressions carefully guarded. "What is this?" Marco demanded, his voice echoing in the vast space. "What do you want?" "We want the truth," Luca said, his voice cold and hard. "We know you were involved in Antonio's death." Marco scoffed, his lip curling in a sneer. "You have no proof," he said. "We have evidence," Serafina said, her voice firm. "We know about your meetings with the Morettas. We know you were planning to betray Antonio." Marco's eyes flickered with anger, but he controlled himself. "You're bluffing," he said. "You have nothing." Luca stepped forward, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "Don't play games with us, Marco," he said. "We know you're lying. Tell us the truth," or he didn't finish the threat, but the implication was clear. Marco's eyes darted nervously between Serafina and Luca, his confidence wavering. I didn't kill him," he stammered, his voice losing some of its arrogance. "I swear. I wanted to, I was planning to, but I didn't do it." "Then who did?" Serafina asked, her voice sharp. "Who killed my husband?" Marco hesitated, his eyes filled with fear. He looked at his soldati, then back at Serafina and Luca. He was trapped, cornered, his lies unraveling around him. "It was," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "It was Donatello." The name hung in the air, heavy with shock, with disbelief, with betrayal. Donatello, the old patriarch, the man who had always claimed to have the family's best interests at heart, had been the mastermind behind Antonio's murder. Serafina felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had suspected Marco. She had even suspected Giovanni, but Donatello, it was unthinkable.
"Why?"
she asked, her voice choked with emotion. "Why would he do this?" Marco's eyes filled with tears. He said Antonio was weak," he stammered. "He said he was leading the family to ruin. He said he had to be stopped." He looked down. "He promised he'd make me the head of the family." The betrayal was complete. Loyalty, Serafina realized, was a fleeting, fragile thing, easily broken, easily manipulated. The truth was a twisted, ugly thing, far more devastating than she could have ever imagined. She looked at Luca, and he knew that their challenges had only just begun. Chapter 11. The Serpent's Embrace. The revelation of Donatello's treachery sent a chilling wave of fear and uncertainty through Serafina and Luca. They knew they were dealing with a formidable adversary, a man who had spent decades consolidating his power, a man who would stop at nothing to protect his interests, his legacy, his family. They retreated to Antonio's secret office, the only place where they felt relatively safe, the only place where they could speak freely, without fear of being overheard, of being betrayed. "We need to be careful," Luca said, his voice low and serious. "Donatello has eyes and ears everywhere. He knows we're onto him." Serafina nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a sense of dread, a sense of impending doom. She knew that Donatello would not hesitate to eliminate them, to silence them permanently, if he felt threatened. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "We need proof," Luca said. "We need something concrete, something we can use to expose him, to bring him down." They spent hours searching through Antonio's files, looking for any evidence, any clue, that could link Donatello to the murder. They found nothing. The old man was too careful, too cunning. He had covered his tracks well. Serafina felt a growing sense of despair, a sense of hopelessness. She was starting to believe that they would never be able to bring Donatello to justice, that he would get away with his crime, that he would continue to rule the family with his iron fist. But Luca refused to give up. He was driven by a fierce determination, a burning desire to avenge Antonio's death, to protect Serafina, to win. He had a plan, a dangerous, reckless plan that could cost them everything. "We need to get inside Donatello's inner circle," he said. "We need to find someone who is willing to betray him, someone who knows the truth."
"And who would that be?"
Serafina asked, her voice skeptical. Luca smiled, a slow, enigmatic smile that made her heart skip a beat.
There's always someone, he said.
Someone who is disgruntled, someone who is ambitious, someone who is vulnerable. He had a target in mind, Isabella, Donatello's young, beautiful, and neglected wife. She was a woman trapped in a gilded cage, a woman who yearned for freedom, for love, for revenge. Serafina was hesitant. She didn't like the idea of using another woman, of exploiting her vulnerability, of dragging her into their dangerous game.
It's too risky, she said.
She could betray us. She could tell Donatello. We have no other choice, Luca said, his voice firm. We need to take the risk. He arranged a meeting with Isabella, a secret rendezvous in a discreet, upscale cafe in the heart of Palermo. Isabella arrived, dressed in a stylish, expensive dress, her dark hair perfectly coiffed, her eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. She was a striking woman, her beauty undeniable, but there was also a sadness about her, a vulnerability that made Serafina's heart ache. Luca introduced himself, his voice smooth, his manner charming, his intentions hidden. He told Isabella that he knew about her unhappiness, about her loneliness, about her desire for something more. He offered her a way out, a chance to escape her gilded cage, a chance to reclaim her life. He offered her freedom. Isabella was hesitant, suspicious. She knew that Luca was a dangerous man, a man associated with Antonio, with the Mancini family, with death. But she was also intrigued, drawn to his charisma, to his power, to his promise. She agreed to help them, to provide them with information, to act as their informant, their spy, their weapon. It was a dangerous alliance, a pact forged in darkness, a serpent's embrace. Serafina knew that they were playing with fire, that they were courting disaster. But she also knew that they had no other choice. They were in too deep, too committed, too entangled. Isabella began to feed them information, small details at first, insignificant clues that slowly, painstakingly, began to paint a picture of Donatello's treachery. She revealed that Donatello had been secretly diverting funds from the family business, that he had been making deals with rival families, that he had been planning to eliminate Antonio for a long time. She also revealed something else, something that shocked Serafina to her core. Donatello, she said, her voice trembling, he's not Antonio's uncle.
He's his father.
The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of generations of lies, of deceit, of incest. Serafina felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The world she thought she knew, the family she thought she belonged to, was a twisted, grotesque parody of reality. She looked at Luca, her eyes filled with horror, with disbelief, with understanding. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place, but the picture that was emerging was more horrifying, more disturbing than she could have ever imagined. And they were in the very center of it. The room seemed to close in, but outside, it was clear and the sun shone. Chapter 12. Masks of Deception. The revelation that Donatello was Antonio's father, not his uncle, cast a long, dark shadow over Serafina's already fractured world. It explained so much. Donatello's obsessive control over Antonio, his ruthless ambition, his willingness to sacrifice anyone, even his own son, to maintain his power. It also deepened the sense of betrayal, the feeling that her entire life had been a carefully constructed lie, a performance orchestrated by a master manipulator. Isabella's information proved invaluable, but also increasingly dangerous. She was walking a tightrope, risking her life with every whispered conversation, every stolen document, every secret meeting. Donatello was a paranoid man, and his suspicion was easily aroused. Serafina and Luca knew they had to act quickly, before Isabella was discovered, before Donatello struck again. They decided to use the information Isabella had provided to confront Donatello, to expose his treachery to the rest of the family, to break his hold on power. It was a risky strategy, a desperate gamble. Donatello still controlled the majority of the soldati, and he would not hesitate to use violence to silence his accusers. Luca arranged a meeting of the entire Mancini family, ostensibly to discuss the future of the business, to address the power vacuum left by Antonio's death. But the real purpose of the meeting was to stage a coup, to overthrow Donatello, to install Serafina as the new head of the family. The meeting took place in the same dining room where Serafina had first faced the family after Antonio's death, the room where she had declared her intention to seek justice, to claim her rightful place. The atmosphere was thick with tension, with anticipation, with fear. Donatello sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of cold authority, his eyes scanning the faces of the assembled family members, assessing their loyalty, their weakness. Marco sat beside him, his expression sullen, his eyes filled with resentment. Giovanni, the Cape Origine, sat across from them, his face impassive, his loyalties uncertain. Serafina and Luca stood at the foot of the table, facing Donatello, their expressions calm and determined, their hands hovering near their concealed weapons. "We have gathered here today," Luca began, his voice clear and strong, "to discuss the future of the Mancini family. As you all know, Antonio's death has left a void, a power vacuum that must be filled." Donatello interrupted, his voice sharp and dismissive.
"There is no void," he said.
"I am the head of the family. I will make the decisions." "You are not the rightful head of the family," Serafina said, her voice ringing with conviction. "You are a usurper, a traitor, a murderer." A gasp went through the room. The men shifted in their seats, their eyes darting nervously between Serafina and Donatello. Marco's face paled, his eyes widening with fear. Giovanni's expression remained unchanged, but his hand moved slightly, closer to his weapon. Donatello's face turned red with anger, his eyes blazing with fury. "You dare to accuse me?"
he roared.
"You, a mere woman, an outsider, a whore?" "I am Antonio's widow," Serafina said, her voice unwavering. "And I have proof of your treachery. I know you killed Antonio. I know you've been stealing from the family. I know you're not even his uncle." She paused, letting her words sink in, letting the shock and disbelief ripple through the room. "I know you're his father," she said, her voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper. The silence that followed was deafening. Donatello's face went white, his eyes filled with a mixture of horror and recognition. He knew he was exposed, his lies unraveling, his power crumbling. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny the accusation, but no words came out. He looked around the table, his eyes searching for support, for loyalty, for escape. But he found none. The men were staring at him, their faces filled with disgust, with betrayal, with judgment. Luca stepped forward, his voice cold and resolute. "It's over, Donatello," he said. "Your reign of terror is finished." He signaled to Serafina, and she nodded, her hand reaching inside her dress, her fingers closing around the cold steel of the pistol Luca had given her. The masks of deception had fallen, revealing the ugly truth beneath. The family, Serafina realized, was not a haven of loyalty and protection, but a viper's nest of betrayal and violence. And she was in the center of it, armed, and for the first time, ready. Donatello rose, and slowly looked around the room. Chapter 13. Flames of Forbidden Desire. The confrontation with Donatello had ended, not in a blaze of gunfire, as Serafina had expected, but in a stunned, anticlimactic silence. The old man, stripped of his authority, his secrets laid bare, had simply collapsed. He had been taken away, not to a prison cell, but to a private clinic, his mind and body ravaged by years of stress, of guilt, of incestuous desire. The power vacuum had been filled, not by Marco, as he had hoped, nor by Giovanni, as many had feared, but by Serafina. She had been elected, unanimously, as the new head of the Mancini family, the first woman in its history to hold such a position. It was a victory, of sorts, but it was also a burden, a responsibility that weighed heavily on her shoulders. She was now in charge of a vast criminal empire, a family riddled with corruption, a world steeped in violence. Luca remained by her side, her consigliere, her advisor, her protector. He guided her, taught her, supported her, helping her navigate the treacherous waters of her new role. He was her rock, her confidant, her everything. The attraction between them, which had been simmering beneath the surface for so long, could no longer be denied. It was a dangerous, forbidden desire, a flame that threatened to consume them both. One evening, after a long and exhausting day of dealing with family business, with rival gangs, with corrupt officials, Serafina found herself alone with Luca in Antonio's old study. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old leather, cigar smoke, and something else. Luca poured 2 glasses of whiskey, handing one to Serafina. She took it, her fingers brushing against his, sending a shiver down her spine. "You were amazing today," he said, his voice low and intimate. "You handled them all perfectly." Serafina managed a weak smile. "I was terrified," she admitted.
"You didn't show it," he said.
"You were strong, confident, decisive. You were a leader." She took a sip of the whiskey, the fiery liquid burning its way down her throat. "I don't know if I can do this, Luca," she said, her voice filled with doubt. "I'm not cut out for this world." He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers.
"You are," he said, his voice firm.
"You have a strength within you, Serafina.
I've always seen it.
You just needed to find it." He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. The contact was electric, sending a jolt of awareness through her entire body. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said, her voice barely a whisper.
"You would have," he said.
"But I'm glad I was here to help." His eyes lingered on her lips, his gaze filled with a mixture of desire and something else. Something that looked a lot like love. Serafina's heart pounded in her chest. She knew she should pull away, that she should maintain a distance, that she should resist. But she couldn't. She leaned in, her lips meeting his in a tentative, hesitant kiss. It was a kiss filled with longing, with passion, with fear. Luca responded, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her closer, deepening the kiss. It was a kiss that erased all doubt, all hesitation, all reason. It was a kiss that sealed their fate. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked together, their hearts pounding in unison. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions, with unacknowledged desires, with undeniable truth. "This is wrong," Serafina whispered, her voice trembling. "I know," Luca said, his voice hoarse, "but it feels so right." He kissed her again, his lips claiming hers with a fierce possessiveness, his hands roaming over her body, igniting a fire within her that she had never known existed. She responded, her own passion unleashed, her inhibitions shattered, her fears forgotten. She was no longer the grieving widow, the reluctant leader, the pawn in a dangerous game. She was a woman, desired, desirable, alive. They made love in Antonio's old study, on the same desk where he had conducted his illicit affairs, where he had plotted his betrayals, where he had died. It was a reckless act, a defiant act, a liberating act. It was a crossing of a line, a point of no return. It was a flame of forbidden desire, burning bright, consuming them both, leaving them vulnerable, exposed, and utterly, irrevocably entangled. The weight of what they had done began to settle in the silence that followed. The flames had subsided, but the embers remained, a constant reminder of the dangerous path they had chosen. And they both knew the passion could very well destroy them. Chapter 14. The Taste of Bitter Regret. The aftermath of their passionate encounter was fraught with a complex mixture of guilt, shame, and a lingering, undeniable desire. Serafina and Luca found themselves caught in a precarious dance, their relationship transformed, their roles blurred, their future uncertain. Serafina, in particular, struggled with the weight of her actions. She had betrayed Antonio's memory. She had violated the sanctity of her marriage vows, even if those vows had been built on lies and deception. She had succumbed to a forbidden passion, a dangerous attraction that threatened to consume her, to destroy everything she had worked so hard to achieve. She tried to distance herself from Luca, to regain control of her emotions, to focus on her responsibilities as the head of the Mancini family. But it was impossible. He was everywhere, his presence a constant reminder of their shared intimacy, of their shared secret. Luca, for his part, was torn between his desire for Serafina and his loyalty to Antonio, to the family, to the code. He had broken his own rules. He had crossed a line he had never intended to cross. He had fallen in love with the widow of his best friend, his boss, his mentor. He knew that their relationship was wrong, that it was dangerous, that it could have devastating consequences. But he couldn't help himself. He was drawn to Serafina, to her strength, her vulnerability, her fire. They tried to maintain a professional distance, to confine their interactions to business matters, to family affairs. But the tension between them was palpable, a simmering undercurrent of desire that threatened to erupt at any moment. One evening, Serafina found herself alone in her room, staring at the city lights, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She felt trapped, suffocated, by the weight of her responsibilities, by the guilt of her betrayal, by the intensity of her feelings for Luca. She needed to escape, to breathe, to think. She decided to go for a walk, to clear her head, to find some peace, some clarity. She slipped out of the palazzo unnoticed, making her way through the narrow, winding streets of Palermo. The city was alive, vibrant, teeming with people, with noise, with life. But Serafina felt utterly alone, isolated, lost in her own thoughts, her own regrets. She found herself drawn to the sea, to the vast, open expanse of water that stretched out before her, a symbol of freedom, of escape, of possibility. She stood on the shore, the cool night air whipping around her, the salty spray of the waves misting her face. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart, to quiet her troubled mind. But it was no use. The image of Luca's face, the memory of his touch, the echo of his voice, haunted her, taunted her, consumed her. She opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the horizon, on the distant, flickering lights of a passing ship. She felt a pang of longing, a yearning for something more, something different. She wished she could escape, to leave everything behind, to start a new life, a life free from the violence, the deception, the betrayal. But she knew she couldn't. She was trapped, bound to the Mancini family, to Luca, to her destiny. Suddenly, a pair of strong arms wrapped around her waist. It was Luca. "I was worried," he said quietly. "You shouldn't be out alone." Serafina tensed and then relaxed. "I needed some air." "I understand," Luca said. He paused. "I also needed to see you." Serafina didn't reply. She and Luca stood and looked at the ocean. The waves told 1,000 stories. Serafina wondered, did any of them end happily? She felt the bitter taste of regret, the heavy weight of her choices, the inescapable reality of her situation. The taste lingered, and she knew it would remain, possibly forever. Chapter 15. The Ghosts of Yesterday. The fragile truce between Serafina and Luca, their attempt to maintain a professional distance, shattered under the weight of their shared secret, their undeniable desire. They found themselves drawn together, again and again, their passion a dangerous, irresistible force that defied reason, defied logic, defied consequences. Their stolen moments, their clandestine encounters, became a refuge, a temporary escape from the harsh realities of their world, from the violence, the betrayal, the constant threat of death. But the ghosts of yesterday haunted them, their pasts intertwined, their futures uncertain. Antonio's shadow loomed large, a constant reminder of their transgression, of their broken vows, of their forbidden love. One day, while going through some of Antonio's old belongings, Serafina stumbled upon a hidden compartment in his desk. Inside, she found a small, antique wooden box, intricately carved with images of wolves and laurel wreaths, the Mancini family crest. Her heart pounded in her chest as she opened the box. Inside, she found a collection of old photographs, letters, and a single, dried rose. The photographs were of Antonio, as a young man, with a woman Serafina didn't recognize. She was beautiful, with long, dark hair, piercing eyes, and a smile that radiated warmth and love. The letters were written in Italian, in a flowing, elegant script. Serafina began to read them, her heart aching with each word. They were love letters, passionate, heartfelt declarations of undying affection, of eternal devotion. They were written by the woman in the photographs, to Antonio. Her name was Isabella. Not the Isabella who was Donatello's young wife, but another Isabella. Serafina's heart sank. This Isabella had been Antonio's first love, his true love, the woman he had wanted to marry, but had been forbidden. The dried rose, Serafina realized, was a memento, a keepsake, a symbol of a love that had been lost, a love that had been betrayed. She closed the box, her hands trembling. She felt a pang of sympathy for Antonio, for the young man who had been denied his happiness, who had been forced to marry a woman he didn't love, a woman who had been chosen for him by his father. She also felt a pang of guilt. She had judged Antonio harshly. She had seen him as a monster, a tyrant, but he had been a victim, too, a victim of his family's ambition, of their twisted code of honor. She understood, now, why he had been so cold, so distant, so cruel. He had been living a lie, a life without love, a life without hope. She looked at the box again, her eyes lingering on the dried rose. She felt a strange connection to Isabella, to the woman who had loved Antonio, to the woman who had been lost. She wondered what had happened to her, where she was now, if she was still alive. She decided to find out. She needed to know the truth, the whole truth, about Antonio's past, about his ghosts. She went to Luca, showing him the box, the photographs, the letters. He looked at them, his expression somber, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and regret. "I knew about Isabella," he said, his voice low. "Antonio told me about her, once. He said she was the love of his life. What happened to her?" Serafina asked, her voice trembling. Luca hesitated, his gaze avoiding hers.
She died," he said.
"A long time ago."
"How?"
Serafina pressed, her heart pounding. Luca took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers. "She was killed," he said, his voice flat. "By Donatello." Serafina gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The room spun around her, the walls closing in. "Donatello killed her?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Luca nodded, his expression grim. "He didn't approve of their relationship," he said. "He wanted Antonio to marry someone suitable. Someone from a powerful family. Someone like you." Serafina felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The cycle of violence, of betrayal, of forbidden love, continued, repeating itself, generation after generation. The ghosts of yesterday were not just haunting her, they were shaping her, controlling her, defining her. And she didn't know if she could ever escape them. She stared out the window. The day had been bright, but the darkness was setting in again. Chapter 16. A symphony of broken promises. The revelation of Isabella's murder at the hands of Donatello deepened the already complex web of deceit and violence that surrounded Serafina. It was a stark reminder of the brutal reality of the mafia world, where love was a weakness, loyalty a commodity, and life a fleeting, precarious thing. It also fueled her determination to break the cycle, to find a way out, to create a different future for herself and for those she loved. The relationship between Serafina and Luca continued to be a source of both comfort and conflict. Their shared passion, their undeniable connection, was a refuge from the storm that raged around them, but it was also a constant source of guilt, of shame, of fear. They knew their love was forbidden, dangerous, potentially fatal. One evening, they found themselves in Antonio's secret office, the room where they had first consummated their love, the room where so many secrets had been revealed, so many promises broken. They were discussing the ongoing investigation into Antonio's murder, the search for the final piece of the puzzle, the identity of the person who had ultimately ordered his death. "We're close," Luca said, his voice low and serious. "We have almost all the pieces. We just need to find the connection." Serafina nodded, her mind racing. She had been reviewing the evidence, the documents, the testimonies, trying to find a pattern, a link, a clue. She had a feeling, a gut instinct, that the answer was hidden in plain sight, that they were missing something obvious, something crucial. She looked at Luca, her eyes searching his. What if, she said, her voice hesitant, what if it wasn't about power or money or revenge? Luca frowned, his brow furrowing. What do you mean? He asked. What if, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, it was about love? Luca's eyes widened slightly, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding. You think, he began, his voice trailing off. I think, Serafina said, her voice firm, that Antonio was killed because of Isabella. Not because of the past, but because of the present. She explained her theory, her hunch, her intuition. She believed that someone close to Antonio, someone who knew about Isabella, someone who loved her, had killed Antonio to avenge her death, to finally bring justice to the woman he had wronged. Luca listened intently, his mind processing the information, the implications, the possibilities. It's possible, he said, his voice thoughtful. It's plausible. But who? Serafina hesitated, her hand trembling. She didn't want to say the name, didn't want to believe it. But she had to. I think, she said, her voice barely a whisper, it was Giovanni. Luca's eyes widened in shock, his expression filled with disbelief. Giovanni? He said. But he was Antonio's most loyal soldier. He was also Isabella's brother, Serafina said, her voice flat. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of revelation, of betrayal, of finality. Luca stared at her, his mind reeling. He knew that Giovanni had a sister, but he had never known her name, her story, her connection to Antonio. It all made sense. Now, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, the picture finally complete. Giovanni, the cold-blooded killer, the enforcer, the man who had always seemed so emotionless, so detached, had been driven by a secret, a hidden passion, a burning desire for revenge. He had avenged his sister's death. He had punished Antonio for his betrayal. He had kept his promise. It was a symphony of broken promises, a tragic tale of love, loss, and retribution. Serafina looked at Luca, her eyes filled with tears. We need to find him, she said, her voice choked with emotion. We need to stop him. Luca nodded, his expression grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. He knew what he had to do. He had to confront Giovanni, his former friend, his colleague, his brother-in-arms. He had to bring him to justice, not just for Antonio's murder, but for Isabella's, for all the broken promises, for all the shattered lives, for all the wasted love. The time for secrets was over. The darkness in the office seemed to press in on them, but they both knew they had no choice but to act. Chapter 17. The Reckoning of Twisted Fates. Confronting Giovanni was a daunting task, a dangerous undertaking that required careful planning, precise execution, and unwavering resolve. He was a formidable opponent, a skilled fighter, a ruthless killer, a man who had spent his life immersed in violence, in betrayal, in the shadows. Serafina and Luca knew they couldn't face him alone. They needed allies, support, a force that could match Giovanni's strength, his cunning, his desperation. They reached out to the remaining members of the Mancini family, the soldati who had sworn loyalty to Antonio, to Serafina, to the Code. They presented their evidence, their theory, their accusation. Some were skeptical, hesitant, unwilling to believe that Giovanni, their trusted comrade, their respected leader, could be capable of such treachery. Others were shocked, outraged, eager to avenge Antonio's death, to punish the traitor. In the end, they secured the support of a small, but loyal, group of men, soldiers who were willing to risk their lives to bring Giovanni to justice, to uphold the honor of the family, to protect Serafina. They devised a plan, a strategy that would lure Giovanni into a trap, a place where they could confront him, where they could end him. They chose the old, abandoned warehouse, the same place where they had confronted Marco, the place where so many secrets had been revealed, so many lives had been shattered. It was a fitting location, a symbolic battleground, a place where the past and the present would collide, where fate would be decided. The night of the reckoning arrived, dark and stormy, the wind howling, the rain lashing against the corrugated iron walls of the warehouse, mirroring the turmoil, the tension, the fear that gripped Serafina's heart. She stood beside Luca, her hand resting on the cold steel of the pistol she carried, her expression calm and determined, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. Giovanni arrived, accompanied by a handful of his own loyal men, his face impassive, his eyes cold and calculating, his demeanor defiant. He knew he was walking into a trap, but he had no choice. He had to face his accusers, to defend his honor, to fight for his life. The confrontation was swift, brutal, and inevitable. Words were exchanged, accusations hurled, truths revealed. But it was the violence that ultimately decided the outcome, the clash of steel, the roar of gunfire, the screams of the dying. Serafina watched, her heart pounding, her breath caught in her throat, as Luca and Giovanni engaged in a fierce, deadly duel, a battle of wills, of strength, of loyalty. They were evenly matched, their skills honed by years of experience, their bodies hardened by countless battles, their minds focused on a single, unwavering goal, to kill or be killed. The fight raged on, back and forth, the advantage shifting from one man to the other, the outcome uncertain, the tension unbearable. Serafina wanted to intervene, to help Luca, to protect him, but she knew she couldn't. This was their fight, their destiny, their reckoning. In the end, it was Luca who emerged victorious, his body battered and bruised, his clothes torn and bloodied, his spirit unbroken. He stood over Giovanni's lifeless body, his chest heaving, his breath ragged, his eyes filled with a mixture of triumph and regret. The battle was over, the reckoning complete, the twisted fates fulfilled. Serafina rushed to Luca's side, her arms wrapping around him, her body trembling with relief, with gratitude, with love. "It's over," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "It's finally over." Luca nodded, his head resting against hers, his arms holding her tight, his heart overflowing. They had survived, they had prevailed, they had won. But the victory was bittersweet, the cost immeasurable, the scars indelible. They had faced the darkness, they had confronted their demons, they had reckoned with their twisted fates. But as the storm cleared and silence descended upon the old warehouse, they knew that the battle may be over, but the war had just begun. They had to rebuild, they had to restore, and, most of all, they had to heal. Chapter 18. Beyond Redemption's Reach. The immediate aftermath of Giovanni's death was a chaotic mix of relief, mourning, and the grim task of consolidating power. Serafina, with Luca's unwavering support, moved swiftly to secure the loyalty of the remaining Mancini soldati, to reassure their allies, and to send a clear message to their rivals. The family was under new management, and any further transgressions would be met with swift and brutal retribution. There were whispers, of course, rumors and speculation about the events that had transpired in the old warehouse, about the true nature of Giovanni's betrayal, about the role Serafina and Luca had played in his demise. But Serafina, drawing on a newfound strength and a steely resolve, refused to be intimidated, refused to be drawn into the endless cycle of violence and vengeance. She was determined to lead the family in a new direction, to break free from the shackles of the past, to forge a different future. But the past, as she soon discovered, was not so easily escaped. The ghosts of Antonio, of Isabella, of Giovanni, continued to haunt her, their memories a constant reminder of the lives that had been lost, the promises that had been broken, the price of her ambition. She found herself increasingly drawn to the sea, to the vast, open expanse of water that offered a temporary respite from the suffocating weight of her responsibilities, from the guilt that gnawed at her soul. One evening, she stood on the shore, the waves crashing against the rocks, the wind whipping her hair around her face, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon. She felt a presence beside her, and turned to see Luca, his face etched with concern, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and sadness. "You can't keep doing this, Serafina," he said, his voice low and gentle. "You can't keep punishing yourself." Serafina sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I don't know how to stop," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The guilt, it's overwhelming. Luca reached out, his hand gently touching her arm.
You did what you had to do, he said.
You protected the family. You avenged Antonio. You saved yourself. But at what cost? She asked, her voice filled with despair. So many lives lost, so much blood spilled, was it worth it? Luca pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her waist, holding her tight.
It was the only way, he said.
There was no other choice. But there has to be another way, she said, her voice pleading. There has to be a way to break the cycle, to escape the violence, to find peace. Luca held her gaze, his eyes filled with a longing that mirrored her own. Maybe there is, he said, his voice hopeful. Maybe together, we can find it. They stood there for a long time, embraced in each other's arms, the sea stretching out before them, a symbol of both the endless possibilities and the insurmountable obstacles that lay ahead. They knew that the road to redemption, to peace, to a different future, would be long and arduous, fraught with challenges, with setbacks, with temptations. They knew that they might never fully escape the shadows of the past, that the ghosts of yesterday might always haunt them, that the price of their choices might be too high to bear. But they also knew one thing for sure. They would face it together. The next morning, Serafina awoke, a new determination clear in her eyes. They had to start somewhere. Chapter 19. The Heart's Silent Confession. The decision to forge a new path, to steer the Mancini family away from its legacy of violence and towards a more legitimate future, was met with resistance, with skepticism, with outright hostility. Many within the family, accustomed to the old ways, to the power and the profit derived from their criminal activities, were unwilling to change, unwilling to embrace Serafina's vision of a different world. There were whispers of dissent, plots of rebellion, threats of insurrection. Serafina knew she had to act decisively, to demonstrate her strength, her resolve, her commitment to her new course. She began by systematically dismantling the family's criminal enterprises, severing ties with corrupt officials, selling off illicit businesses, and investing in legitimate ventures. She established a foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to helping the victims of organized crime, to providing education and opportunities for the disadvantaged, to atoning for the sins of the past. She faced opposition at every turn, from within her own ranks, from rival families, from the very fabric of Sicilian society, which had been steeped in the mafia's influence for generations. But she persevered, driven by a fierce determination, by a burning desire to redeem her family's name, to create a better future for her community, to honor the memory of those who had been lost. Luca remained her steadfast ally, her confidant, her lover. He supported her every decision. He protected her from her enemies. He loved her unconditionally. But their relationship was still a source of tension, of guilt, of uncertainty. They knew they couldn't continue to live in the shadows, to hide their love, to deny their feelings. One evening, they found themselves alone in Serafina's suite, the room where their forbidden passion had first ignited, the room where so many secrets had been shared, so many promises broken. They were discussing the latest challenges, the threats, the obstacles that stood in their way. "I'm tired, Luca," Serafina said, her voice weary, her shoulders slumping. "I'm tired of fighting, tired of the violence, tired of the lies." Luca reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "I know," he said, his voice soft and tender. "But we're almost there. We just need to keep going." "And then what?" she asked, her eyes searching his. "What happens when we finally achieve our goal? What happens to us?" Luca hesitated, his gaze avoiding hers. He knew what she was asking, what she was yearning for. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "I don't know if we can ever be together. Not openly. Not honestly." Serafina's heart sank. She had known, deep down, that their love was doomed, that they could never truly escape the past, that they could never be free. But she had hoped, she had prayed, that she was wrong, that there was a chance, a possibility, a future for them. Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. "I love you, Luca," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I love you more than anything in the world. Luca's eyes met hers, his own gaze filled with a mixture of love and pain. I love you too, Serafina, he said, his voice equally emotional. More than life itself. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight, as if he could protect her from the world, from the truth, from himself. They stood there, embraced in each other's arms, their hearts beating in unison, their souls intertwined, their love a beacon of hope in a sea of darkness. It was a silent confession, a heartfelt declaration, a promise that transcended words, that defied logic, that endured. They knew that their path would be difficult, that their love might be forbidden, that their future was uncertain. But there, that night, they were together. And in the grand scheme of things, perhaps that was enough. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. The final confrontation, the ultimate test of Serafina's leadership, of her commitment to change, of her love for Luca, came not from a rival family, not from a disgruntled soldier, not from a corrupt official, but from within her own heart. The pressure to conform, to return to the old ways, to embrace the mafia's legacy of violence and power, had been relentless. She had faced threats, intimidation, even attempts on her life. But she had remained steadfast, unwavering in her determination to forge a new path, to create a different future for the Mancini family. But the greatest challenge, the most difficult obstacle, came from an unexpected source, her own conscience. She had been haunted by the ghosts of the past, by the memories of Antonio, of Isabella, of Giovanni, of all those who had been lost, all those who had been betrayed. She had been tormented by guilt, by shame, by the weight of her own choices. She had begun to question herself, to doubt her ability to lead, to doubt her right to happiness, to doubt her love for Luca. She realized that she could not move forward, she could not truly embrace the future until she had confronted her past, until she had reconciled with her demons, until she had forgiven herself. She decided to make a pilgrimage, a journey to the place where it had all begun, the place where her father had lived, the place where he had died. She traveled to the small fishing village on the coast of Sicily, the village where Alessandro Moretti, the soldato of the Rossi family, had spent his life, the village where he had raised his daughter, the village where he had been murdered. She walked the streets, she visited the church, she talked to the locals, she breathed the air that her father had breathed. She found his grave, a simple, unmarked stone in the village cemetery. She stood there alone, her heart aching with grief, with regret, with love. She spoke to him, silently, in her heart, telling him about her life, about her struggles, about her hopes. She asked for his forgiveness, for his guidance, for his blessing. And then she made a decision. She returned to Palermo, to the Mancini Palazzo, to Luca. She gathered the family, the soldati, the loyalists. She stood before them, her head held high, her eyes clear and bright, her voice firm and resolute. I have made a decision, she said. I am stepping down as head of the Mancini family. A gasp went through the room. The men shifted in their seats, their eyes darting nervously between Serafina and Luca. I am leaving Palermo, she continued. I am leaving Sicily. I am starting a new life, a life free from violence, free from betrayal, free from the mafia. She looked at Luca, her eyes filled with love, with regret, with hope. I am asking you to come with me, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I am asking you to leave this life behind, to start anew, to be with me. The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes were on Luca, waiting for his response, for his decision, for his fate. Luca stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Serafina, his heart overflowing with love, with admiration, with respect. I will go wherever you go, he said, his voice clear and strong. I will always be by your side. It was a final confrontation, not of guns and knives, but of hearts and loyalties. Serafina had chosen love, she had chosen freedom, she had chosen a different path. And Luca had chosen her.
He was all in.
And with that decision, they were truly free. They were no longer bound by the chains of the past, by the legacy of violence and the ghosts. The path was finally clear. Epilogue. The small, whitewashed villa overlooked the turquoise waters of the Aegean Sea. It was a world away from the dark, cobbled streets of Palermo, from the opulent, suffocating palazzo of the Mancini family, from the ghosts of the past. Serafina stood on the terrace, the warm Mediterranean breeze caressing her face, the scent of bougainvillea and jasmine filling the air. She watched as Luca played with their two young children, a boy and a girl, their laughter echoing across the sun-drenched garden. It had been 5 years since they had left Sicily, since they had turned their backs on the mafia, since they had chosen love, freedom, and a different future. It hadn't been easy. They had faced challenges, obstacles, setbacks. They had struggled to adapt to a new life, to a new culture, to a new identity. They had changed their names, they had cut all ties with their past, they had disappeared. But they had also found peace, happiness, and a sense of belonging. They had built a new life, a life filled with love, with laughter, with hope. Serafina had found a new purpose, a new passion. She had become a teacher, sharing her knowledge, her wisdom, her experience with the local children. She had found fulfillment in nurturing young minds, in shaping the future, in making a difference. Luca had found a new calling, too. He had become a fisherman, working with his hands, providing for his family, connecting with the sea, with nature. He had found contentment in the simplicity of his life, in the beauty of his surroundings, in the love of his family. They had healed, they had grown, they had transformed. They still carried the scars of the past, the memories of the violence, the betrayal, the loss. But those scars were no longer wounds, they were reminders. Reminders of where they had come from, of what they had overcome, of who they had become. They had learned that love could conquer all, that freedom was worth fighting for, that hope could spring eternal. They had learned that the past could not be changed, but the future could be shaped, that destiny was not predetermined, but chosen. They had learned that forgiveness was the key to healing, that redemption was possible, that a new life could begin, even after the darkest of nights. Serafina smiled, her heart overflowing with gratitude, with joy, with love. She had found her paradise, her sanctuary, her home. And as the sun set over the Aegean Sea, casting a golden glow over the villa, over the garden, over her family, she knew that she had finally found peace, that she had finally found herself. She looked at Luca, and their eyes met. The silent confession was still there, after all of these years. And it always would be.